Okay, then the recording had started. I can talk then. So, welcome to the medical science e-session, and actually our second e-session for this term for the EGA Spring Assembly section. And today our topic will be Entering Joker's Mind, the Neuroscience of Evil. So, my name is Berkay Akad Ülker, and I'm the EMSA Medical Science Director for the term of 2019 and 20. You can reach me from my personal email, science@emsaeurope.eu, and you can ask me questions about EMSA Medical Science, and also you can reach me out with your special FMO projects regarding medical science. And if you want any feedback, you can also reach my assistants either. In this session, we're going to talk about the mental background of Joker, the movie character, and the criminality behind that. The general background information about mental health disorders, the relation of suicides and mental health disorders, quick history lesson and the situation nowadays, a current perspective on neurocriminology, mental health in the context of justice systems, and different views on the psychology of Joker. So, the Joker 2019 movie is a worldwide famous psychological drama set in 1981. Arthur Fleck, a failed stand-up comedian, transforms into Joker, whose insanity and nihilism inspires a violent countercultural revolution against the wealthy in a decaying Gotham City. So, what is the condition of Joker? The famous laughter or Joker is perceived as a disease, maybe a tic, or a neurological condition. This condition is known as the Pseudobulbar Effect, or we can say it like emotional incontinence. Pseudobulbar Effect is a type of emotional disturbance characterized by uncontrollable episodes of crying and or laughing, or sometimes other emotional displays. PBA occurs secondary to a neurologic disorder or brain injury. Patients may find themselves crying uncontrollably at something that is only moderately sad, being unable to stop themselves for several minutes. Sometimes the episodes may switch between emotional states, resulting in the patient crying uncontrollably before dissolving into fits of laughter, like you see in the Joker movie, and lots of times in many scenes of that movie. So, Joker's famous laugh. Actually, a psychoanalyst, though, could have a different interpretation of Joker's famous laugh rather than a neurological condition as PBA, a defense mechanism. We later learn in the movie that Joker was severely abused and neglected by his delusional mother during childhood, leading him to hardwired suffering and developing a sense of rootless and sad universe. However, his mother always mentions that he was a happy child. Therefore, Joker becomes terribly confused, which leads to a duality of his character. The inside and outside worlds do not match. So, as you can see in the table, just let me use my laser pointer. Actually, the PPA may be often misdiagnosed as a clinical depression. However, actually many clear distinctions exist here. For example, the duration of the PPA is seconds to minutes, but the depression is weeks to months, and that's the most important distinction between each other. So, in some cases, depressed mood and PBA may also coexist. Since depression is one of the most common emotional changes in patients with neurodegenerative diseases, it is often comorbid with the PBA. Comorbidity implies that if depression is distinct from PBA and is not necessary for a diagnosis of PBA. And also, as you can see here, the behavior does not change in PBA, but in depression, it changes. As the effect of the PBA, you can see it's unrelated to or independent of mood. So if someone's happy, that someone can cry too, or that someone is angry, it may cause them to laugh hysterically, as in the film. But in depression, the people feel more like sad, worried, guilty, depressed, and most often concurrent with mood. So lastly, talking about the stimulus. Actually, for the PBA, the stimulus is non-specific, minimal, or inappropriate to situation, like you see in the Joker film. And also, there is a famous train scene in that movie, if you've seen it. But for depression, it's specific mood-related situations. So after some situations, people might feel weak, and that causes depression. But it's not something like instantly coming out for patients. So, but how do psychiatric illnesses affect criminal acts likelihood? The Joker film was also surprisingly accurate in its depiction of the way that he was driven to reactive aggression. Mentally ill people do not plot to be a criminal. Instead, they react impulsively and emotion-driven. In the film, all of Joker's violence seems authentic because it is reactive aggression, as you can see in the many parts of the film, and also that this scene, which is really authentic, as you can see there, is actually a reactive aggression scene from like not with his will, but it happens really instantly as reactive, as we talk here. In the future, research may focus on discovering useful factors in the development of aggression which would shed light on preferred treatment methods. Understanding factors contributing to violence will hopefully contribute to further eliminating stigma about mental illnesses and conditions. So, as a summary here, and also as take-home messages about this part of our presentation. First of all, most individuals with serious mental illnesses are not dangerous. Most acts of violence are committed by individuals who are not mentally ill. Individuals with serious mental illness are victimized by violent acts more often than they commit violent acts. Being a young male or a substance abuser such as alcohol or drugs is a greater risk factor for violent behavior than being mentally ill. No evidence suggests that people with serious mental illness receiving effective treatment are more dangerous than individuals in the general population. So please have these on your mind when you see someone with mental illnesses and conditions. They're not always following the path of being evil or following the path of being criminals. Actually, if someone takes a good amount of drugs and actually takes the good treatment, then it doesn't cause them to be any criminal events actually. And if people get treated safely, then it would be much more better for them in their future life. And we should be aware of that. So, as a conclusion, we can take individuals with mental illness do not pose any increased risk of violence over the general population when appropriately treated, as I said before. Violence and mental illness are not without connection, however, as they share many biologic and psychosocial aspects. The relationship between mental illness and violent behavior has serious implications from a public health perspective. The role of medication in controlling violent behavior along with the target symptoms needs to be further clarified. So, as an end of this part, you can see my references here about this session, and also the references will be sent out to you with the YouTube video when it's uploaded as a follow-up email after this session.
So hello again, everyone. My name is Daniela Koch, and I'm the Medical Science Research and Internal Assistant. And today I'm going to talk about the anatomy of violence. So I'm going to be focusing on the current situation and views on mental illness. So going on to the next slide. Okay, first of all, to give you some numbers, mental health disorders in general remain widely underreported, especially at lower incomes where there's just in general less data and less attention and treatment for mental health disorders. However, there are estimates that mental health disorders affect nearly 800 million people worldwide, which means that every 10th person globally suffers from a mental disorder. What is also interesting to look at is the prevalence by gender. So in females, for example, depression, anxiety disorder, eating disorders, and bipolar disorders seems to be more common, whereas in males, schizophrenia, alcohol and drug use disorders is more prevalent. Yes, you have a question? You can just ask in the chat or maybe just say it.
What about ADHD is the question.
Sorry, I don't have any exact numbers on that. I think, are you talking about how common it is or the genders? I think, don't pin me down on that. I think it's more common in males. And yeah, and I sadly can't give you any numbers on how common it is in the general population. But yeah, I hope that answers your question at least a little bit. Again, sorry, I don't have any numbers right here. Like when we go into the next slide, you can see, yeah, exactly right here. No, that's fine. Sorry, Becca. I meant this chart. And this shows which mental health disorders are the most common. So ADHD isn't mentioned here. So I think it's definitely less common than depression and anxiety disorders. So you can see here that anxiety disorders affects around 3.8%, and depression, as many of you thought, it's really common, but less common than anxiety disorders. So it affects around 3.4%. And also when you look on the right, you can again see that it seems to be a lot more common in females than in males. Also talking about substance abuse disorders, which you can see at the bottom of the chart, you can see it affects around 2.3%. And the most common form is alcohol abuse with 1.4%. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Now we're going to have a quick glance on mental health disorders and this gathering across the globe. The distribution for depression and anxiety disorder seems to be quite similar. It's on the top left and on the top right for anxiety disorders. It's very prevalent in the Western world. And for example, in contrast, for bipolar disorder, which is on the bottom left, you see it's, for example, less common in the US, but a lot more common in South American countries such as Brazil. And also quite interestingly, eating disorders on the bottom right seem to be a lot more common in Australia than in the rest of the world. Okay, moving on. Okay, the next topic I'm going to be talking about is death from mental health disorders, which can be categorized in the direct death toll and the indirect death toll. So the direct death toll from mental health disorders is usually quite low. An exception is, on the one hand, substance use disorders. So for example, if a person overdoses, and also eating disorders, which occur through malnutrition and related health complications, more focusing on the eating disorders. The morbidity and mortality rates in patients are thought to be high, but exact rates remain to be clarified. But for example, talking about anorexia nervosa, it has a negative health impact with only 46% of patients fully recovering. A third still suffers from partial or residual features of the disorder, and 20% remain chronically ill for the long term. So you can see, even though it does not kill directly often, patients very often suffer from negative long-term effects on their health. Okay, so the next thing we're talking about is the indirect death toll, so meaning inflicted self-harm and suicides. And this toll is definitely a lot higher. For example, in high-income countries, studies suggest that up to 90% of suicide deaths result from underlying mental and substance use disorders. Whereas in low to middle income countries, this number is a bit lower, around 70%, for example, in China, Taiwan, and India. But I think we can all still agree on the fact that 70% is still quite a high number, and mental health disorders is definitely a big contributor to suicide attempts. All right, moving on. Giving you some more numbers on deaths from mental health disorders. Globally, there are around 800,000 people who die from suicide every year. And to give you some perspective on that number, that's twice the number from homicides. Around 1.4% of global deaths were from suicide. I think this number is from 2017. But in some countries, this number can be even higher. So for example, some countries that have really high suicide rates in comparison are Lithuania, Eastern countries such as Russia, for example, also Guyana in South America, and South Korea in Asia. And globally, the suicide rate for men is twice as high as for women. You can also see that in the graph below. So on the left and on the right, you have the attempted suicides. So on the left for men, on the right for women. I think these data, like from the graph, are from Germany, but it's like just an example for a European country. You can see that women try suicide more often, but actually men make up 74% of completed suicides. So on the left and right, you have like the attempts, and in the middle, you have the completed suicides, meaning that the person actually died. And there, the percentage of men who died is a lot higher. Talking about the methods of killing oneself, you can see that poisoning, at least in Germany and in many European countries, is quite popular, but is not as effective, for example, as in comparison to hanging oneself. So you can see that on the left, around 55%, 56% of males who hung themselves died. And for women, this number is around 30%. Also, when you talk about the methods of committing suicide, it's also important to look at the country you're talking about. So for example, in the US and in Switzerland, where owning a firearm is a lot more common, people shoot themselves more often than in Germany or in other European countries. But yeah, I thought that's quite interesting to see. So moving on to the next slide. That's the last slide that I'm going to be talking about suicides. Here you can see which mental health disorder increases the risk for suicide the most. So you can see most likely individuals with depression who are 20 times more likely to die from suicide than someone without it. And also, for example, for anxiety disorder, this number is around 3. For schizophrenia, it's around 13 times more likely. And for bipolar disorder, it's 6 times more likely. Okay, moving on. So the next topic I'm going to be talking about is just a quick glance at the history of mental health disorders. So in the early history, mental illness was seen as the product of supernatural forces and demonic possession, and really primitive treatments were used to kind of cure these people. For example, trepanning in an effort to release the offending spirits, or submission to physical restraint and solitary confinement in asylums. Then later, in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there were a lot of developments and more modern theories of psychopathology emerged. So the two main theories back then, I guess you've all heard of them, was the psychodynamic theory by Freud and the theory of behaviorism by Watson. So Freud's theory of psychodynamics centered on the notion that mental illness was a product of the interplay of unresolved unconscious motives and should be treated through various methods of open dialogue with the patients. Whereas behaviorism, on the other side, suggested that psychopathology was more closely related to the effects of behavioral conditioning, and that treatment should focus on methods of adaptive reconditioning. So yeah, but these main theories and many other developments led to new approaches to the diagnosis and treatment, especially in the 20th century. Moving on to the next slide. Also adding to the developments in the 20th century, the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders was published in 1952, which systematically categorized mental disorders. And also modern pharmacological treatments were founded. So for example, the first antipsychotics are introduced in 1950. Even though there were many developments in the 20th century, there were also still many prejudices against people with mental illness. And one really brutal example for that is Nazi Germany, where, again, as in the Kahoot game also asked, there were over 200,000 people with physical and mental disabilities murdered, and there were over 400,000 forced sterilizations. And also adding here, maybe why many of you were confused about the number, there were definitely millions of people killed during the Third Reich in Germany, but many of them were, for example, Jews. And people with physical and mental disabilities that were murdered, the number is just 200,000, but I think it's still really high. Okay, yeah, thank you. So the last topic I'm going to be talking about is stigma surrounding mental disorders. So in general, studies show that the public disapproves persons with psychiatric disabilities significantly more than persons with physical illness. And this also kind of includes that persons with mental illness are perceived to be more in control of their disability and responsible for causing them. And also persons are less likely to pity a person with mental illness, instead reacting to their illness with anger and believing that help is not deserved. Also, common stigmas in the Western world are fear and exclusion, meaning that persons with severe mental illness should be feared and therefore be kept out of most communities. Authoritarianism, sorry, difficult word, which means that persons with severe mental illness are irresponsible, so life decisions should be made by others. And also relating to that, benevolence, which means that persons with severe mental illness are childlike and need to be cared for. Okay, moving on. So these stigmas can have really severe consequences for the everyday life of people suffering from mental illness. So it can lead to withholding help, or in general, just social avoidance. Then in their general life, difficulties obtaining good jobs and leasing safe housings. And also people who with psychiatric disabilities who live in a society that widely endorses stigmatizing ideas can internalize these ideas and believe that they are less valued because of their psychiatric disorders. So it can lead to lowered self-esteem. So these are very important issues. And to conclude this part, it is important to note that there are still many stigmas concerning mental illnesses, and more awareness and education is urgently needed to break these and change the situation for people that are affected. Okay, moving on. This is the end of my presentation. You can here scan the code for the references, and thank you all for listening.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lara. I'm the Capacity Building Assistant to the Health Policy Pillar of MedSci, and I'm super excited to be here today. I will kind of elaborate a bit on what Daniela and Berkay talked about. Mine is kind of in the intersection of their topics. So let's begin with the neuroscience of violence. And as Daniela said, mental illness does not equate committing a crime or being violent. And that has been the perception of many people. People might perceive mentally ill people as dangerous, and that has been the perception for quite a while, which could be one of the biggest reasons behind why these people cannot get the help that they need. Research does suggest that patients with mental illness may be more prone to violence if they do not receive adequate treatment. If they are, actively experiencing delusions, have long-standing paranoia, and obviously these patients are often under the overwhelming influence of their psychiatric illness. And I'm not going to repeat what Berkay said. These individuals with psychiatric disorders are not violent by nature, only because of their mental illness. If anything, as a Guardian article suggested, they are more likely to be the victims of violence. And some research in the US interviewed people about how they perceived mentally ill people, and they responded with saying, they are persons with not in touch with reality, or they live in their own world, or they're just nuts. And these phrases are like incredibly stereotypical, where they put all mentally ill people into the same basket. So there are so many stereotypes to break here, and there's so much work to be done. I can continue. One important phrase with mental health in the context of justice systems is deinstitutionalization, wow, of the mentally ill people. And this is described as when hospital capacity for mentally ill patients has been dropping drastically in the US and some other nations where states kind of stopped funding some of these hospitals and they were sent to private homes or to the cares of their families to deal with their illness. And obviously, these people are not experts on what they're having to deal with on a daily basis. So this resulted with them getting less supervision, less supports, considerable difficulties for families, and especially if these patients are unwilling to deal with their disease, or if their families are unwilling to deal with them, they obviously will not get the help that they deserve and that they need. By some estimates, a 90-day treatment in a mental health hospital might actually avoid 10-year imprisonment of an individual with mental illness. So that's incredibly moving to think about, actually. And this process is thought to result in an overall increase in imprisonment of inmates with prior mental hospitalization, because they're not treated and they run into the law, and the behavior of the law is just to take them, throw them into the jail, and they're expected to take care of themselves. And as the code here says, some patients admitted to psychiatric hospitals by way of the courts are mentally ill without being in any sense bad. And this quote is from 1970, and like this kind of fight to break the stereotypes of mentally ill people has been going on for a very, very long time. And I want to talk about the insanity defense, which was asked in the code. And that's basically when a mentally ill patient commits a crime that goes against the law. Their attorneys can use that to explain that they were not in control of their action at the time. And in the legal system, apparently, I'm not an expert on this, obviously, there are two factors for criminal sanction, and one of them refers to the intent to commit a crime, and the second one refers to the act fitting with the criminal statute. So the second one is working, but the first one, the fact that they need to have the intent to commit the crime, cannot be justified in the case of some mental illnesses. Let's continue. Yeah. And let's discuss Joker in a bit more detail. There are so many perspectives when it comes to how people view the narrative of Joker as a person and as he grows up with a deranged mother and as a poor man and who wants to take revenge for the things that he has gone through. Some people think that Joker psychology is like those of mass shooters, and mass shooters has been all around the news. They are terrifying events for many schools. I'm sure you have read the news. And there was one mass shooter that opened fire in the Aurora Theater. I think it was in Hollywood. And there were so many people killed there. And I think it was in 2012 during the screening of the Black Knight movie. And their families are still dealing with the shock of that event. And some people were interviewed from the parents of the children who were killed, and they say they're scared that some people will identify with the Joker and they'll find it empowering, and they will need to follow what Joker did and take revenge, instead of being isolated and feeling wronged by the world. That's what they're afraid of, and that's one perspective. And another is that Joker does indeed represent mental illness and people turning to crime in a successful way. And one of the most prominent presenters of this perspective is Adrian Raine, as Berkay said, I think. He is a famous neurocriminologist, and he wrote a book called The Anatomy of Violence. He said he's planning to show it in his lessons and stuff, and that it is an incredible representation of how mental illness, when untreated, can result in the feeling of being wronged in the world. But some say that in the movie, it seems as though Joker does what he does because he is mentally ill. And that might be a wrong picture, because mental illness, like we said, does not equate criminality. And it might look like Joker justifies what he's doing because he's mentally ill. But I don't think that's the whole picture presented in the movie. We are seeing the story of a man with serious innate issues made worse by childhood trauma and social abuse. And mental illness alone does not account for what Joker turns into throughout the movie. And some experts say that Joker has some traits that are particular to disturbed characters rather than generally mentally ill people. And then I'm going to move on to my last point. And not everyone gets the help that they need. This is the general message that I would like to leave you with, and it is that there is still such a huge stigma around mental health, and going to therapy and seeing someone to get the help that you feel like you need. And to break the links between mental illness and criminal acts, we require an international and interprofessional team of psychiatrists, social workers, patient advocates, to detect and reduce these factors that drive a person over the edge. And for those people inside the justice system who have been punished, but they are extremely ill and they are not being helped in any way, there needs to be a targeted approach that includes rehabilitation, education, empowerment. Adrian Raine also said that mental illness might be a predisposition to violent behavior, and I think that's because that's when these people cannot be assisted. And I want to tell you about a fact that's disturbing to me. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics in the US, more than half of those in the criminal justice system suffer from a mental illness. And that might be one of the results, at least a branch of the deinstitutionalization process. And a lot of these people are being arrested for petty crimes like jaywalking, urinating in public, sleeping on the street, public nuisance, and so most of these are not dangerous. Adrian Raine believes that the movie authentically traces the way a man could be driven to deeply troubling acts of violence by a combination of genetics, childhood trauma, untreated mental illness, and societal provocation. So there are many, many factors that drive Joker over the edge. And yes, the bias extends all the way, where persons with mental illness get treated as criminals and arrested, and stay a longer time in jail compared to the general population. And so that probably is a huge obstacle in the way of breaking the stigma around mental illness and helping these people get the help that they need. And after this, we would like to invite you to discuss the character of Joker and whether you feel sympathy towards the narrative of Joker and or his behavior. You might want to discuss this in the context of the movie, like how it's being represented if you've seen it. Or you might want to view it from the perspective of economic or racial bias and ethnic bias, which is also an incredibly disturbing presence in the treatment of mental illnesses and neurological disorders. There are so many racial disparities that play into that. Do you think that the movie aims to justify crimes committed by a poor and mentally ill man? Does it increase the stigma around mentally ill people and the perception of their dangerousness, which has been documented in many ways, where people think that mentally ill people are dangerous, basically? So you can scan this QR code on screen right now and vote what you think, and we'll share the results in a bit as you start voting, and then we would like to split you into groups and have you discuss a bit there, and when you come back you could maybe tell us what you've discussed. And
Great. So first of all, I want to ask Daniela and Lara, what were the results of your groups and what are the discussions that were going on?
I can start. Yes, in my group, I think we were all on the same page, and we went into discussing quite a few things actually related to mental health. We did sympathize with Joker on a lot of levels, and we agreed that he was essentially, I don't want to use this word because it sounds so intense, but kind of betrayed by society because he couldn't afford getting the help that he needed, and he was isolated, and he was suffering from many conditions, which pushed him over the edge. And we discussed how some people were saying, many people are suffering from mental illness, but they know how to control themselves. I saw some articles written with this principle, and we talked about how it's not about controlling yourself, because sometimes you just are not able to do that with mental illness. And obviously nobody wants violence, but it is obvious that these people need to be taken care, need to be cared for and treated like human beings, like any other person, instead of being thrown into prisons and left to their own devices, where they can't even properly communicate to anyone else, and they cannot be back in society in a healthy way. That's essentially what we discussed.
And what about Daniela's group?
Okay, yeah, I think our discussion was partly at least quite similar. So I think we all agreed on the fact that we can sympathize with Joker and that the movie helped to understand his character and also his character development, but that it's also important to note that it doesn't justify its actions. So when you look at the general picture, still what he did was very wrong. So it helps understanding him, but not saying that what he's doing is right. But understanding him helps to empathize the point that there is something that can be done in the general society. So like improve like the system around him to give him help to prevent the development that he had in his life. So for example, as you also said, that just like imprisoning people or something is not a solution for anyone eventually. So there should definitely be a focus on that. And I think our last point was, but also was that it's important for anyone with a mental illness to also at least be a bit aware of their situation and that they have a problem, because if they don't kind of put in the effort to better their situation, then like the outside sources also can't help. There's like a limit to help that you can provide from the outside. But yeah, I think that were the main points that we discussed.
Great. And any other opinions? And anyone who wants to elaborate on the discussion? No one? Like, no one wants to add anything on these things? I don't know. I can see some people maybe wanting to talk from the open cameras, but I don't know. I will not force anyone. You can just come out and talk and share your opinions.
All right, can I ask a question?
Of course.
So, although the what governments and institutes can do can be very, very beneficial for individuals, but I think it's paramount for the individual to know what to do when you yourself or your friends, family members are having such problems. Instead of, because I have a background in Chinese culture, and in Chinese, mental illness is literally the worst thing you can say to a person. It means you're incapable of doing anything. 神经病 literally means you have neurodegenerative disorder or something. Direct translation. So what can we, that's my question, what can we personally do to better the lives of others around us who are suffering from mental illness?
For this question, what I've been actually searching for is first of all, the word usage. It is like, as we say here, just give attention to when I'm using mental illness and when I'm using mental conditions. So what I mean by mental illnesses is basically when there is a problem with the brain, which is physical and which is also pathological, and that needs to be changed with surgery or with medications. But the mental conditions are like a real different level. They are not actually pathological. They are actually according to the thinking methods of people. And when you mean conditions, it's actually much more different to talk about the mental health. For example, what can a mental illness be? It can be a maybe temporal lobe structural problem, or maybe a deficiency of seeing in front, or maybe a deficiency of hearing loss, or maybe something like that, or maybe a car crash that may cause a functional loss on brain. But when you talk about mental conditions, it's much more like schizophrenia or anxiety disorders or depression or the other things. And actually, these are the things that we should be talking much more bravely. In this society, people are really afraid to talk about the conditions when of their mental conditions, and they feel like they're going to be treated really bad because the society does that. In the Joker film, actually, the main message is people are the outsiders of their society because the society doesn't want people in, and they don't normalize people, but they mostly abnormalize people. They see that the people who have mental conditions are the abnormal people. But actually, I think in one of the breakout rooms, I talked about that. What is the definition of normal? Actually, normal is kind of a cultural thing. For example, a person who's coming from a different country, for me, may not be abnormal, and I may consider that person specifically abnormal for my country. But there are many cultural differences. So when you think about that, it happens in the mental conditions too. Actually, we should understand people and we should be talking about people. For example, actually, there is a lots of percentage of people having anxiety disorders in their life, even in a short amount of time. There are lots of people having major depression during their lifetime, according to maybe an examination that could define their life story, or maybe a thing that is really important to their relatives, or actually even the loss of one's relative may cause a major depression. But we don't talk about it. We're really afraid to talk about it. And when we try to talk about it, our relatives say that go to a psychiatrist, go to a neurologist, just take your medications, and etc. If someone has a medical condition such as depression, they're afraid to tell that to us. And let me tell you the reason, because I have friends who are depressed. They're afraid to have a stigma against them. For example, if someone tells that they have a depression, then whenever they act sad, or whenever they don't have the mood and they're not happy, we ask this specific question, which hurts them really too much. Didn't you take your medicine? So we actually expect them to take their medicine and always laugh. If people don't laugh, then we don't talk to them. We are afraid to talk to them. So again, as a summary, how we should act to people is to first accept them as a human being, and know the conditions itself. If they are the ones that we care too much, like our friends, our family, then we should literally just research about the condition. It's like the depression is a definition that we don't actually know. Even for this presentation, while researching what is depression and what is the difference between pseudobulbar affection and depression, I saw that there were many, many differences between them. And actually, uh, there are so much things that we should be learning. And also, about having a glance about the mental health. You can also join the mental health trainings in the future, as MSAV will be having. It will be also very educative for people. And also there are I think, the Instagram posts for that. You can also join that. But again, what we can do is to talk with people, to research, and to change our ideas. Just to try to talk with people. That doesn't also count for medical conditions, but also, for example, count for the disabled people, like, as we can say, the Down syndrome. In the child parks or the child playgrounds, you see that many parents take their children from the other children who have Down syndromes or maybe other mental conditions, because people don't want their children to have any connection with them. But also that leads to the problems that we've been talking inside the breakout rooms for talking about the Joker film. They feel really angry to the society because the society doesn't want them in. But if you get them inside the society, you will see that it is actually getting better and better for them. I hope that I answered this question really well. And I also have a special interest in neuropsychiatry. I've been reading lots of things about this. And also, I see that it doesn't, uh, it's not really important if your country is an improved country or not an improved country.